Thanks for having me. My name's Michael, and I'm based at Aston University across the city. And I'm a psychologist, not a philosopher. And I'm probably going to venture into some non-psychological territory, but not embarrass myself by venturing into any philosophy. The title comes from a phrase that I've encountered family therapists using when they're talking about their work in reflecting teams. And the idea that I've taken from it is that sometimes it's quite useful just to reformulate a problem in a way which is just different enough for you to notice some of the things that you've been taking for granted about how the problem is construed. So sometimes just changing the frame or the way of thinking about a problem is a useful thing to do and can make us see the problem in different terms. And when Lisa asked me to talk about loneliness, I thought, well, there's a few different ways I could do that. I'm a mental health researcher who particularly works on the role of relationships in mental health, and I tend to focus on how relationships can be helpful. In what ways do people draw upon support, connectedness, belonging, those kinds of things in order to cope. But Lisa and I supervised a PhD a couple of years ago by Valeria Motta, which was about the experience of loneliness and the phenomenology of that. So I could have spoken a bit about that work, but that's Valeria's work. And I could have spoken, I got really, nearly really sidetracked by just thinking about Ned the Lonely Donkey, which I am going to mention. But there is definitely a 20-minute talk in Ned the Lonely Donkey, but that's not this one. I thought what I would talk about is what I think might be missing from the increasingly psychological focus on loneliness as a problem. And it's interesting because we're sort of toing and froing between two framings of loneliness. One is the sort of conventional one that's out there, which is that loneliness is a personal experience. It's a sort of a kind of psychological content, or there's a phenomenology to it that is to do with one's experience of oneself as being isolated and disconnected. And I think in a lot of our cultural reference points for loneliness, that is what we would see, and that's probably what we bring to the topic. In the last 10 years, something interesting happened. Loneliness has become reconfigured as a kind of social problem, as something that has costs and about which we should be concerned. And I'm quite interested in how that's happened and in thinking a bit about some of the consequences of transferring that idea in the bottom right, that bigger idea of loneliness as a social problem, and what we might be missing in the way that we make that transfer. I'm probably going to do a better job of asking questions than answering them, but I'll try to say a little bit about why I think that's interesting. So what happens when we construe loneliness as a social problem? We shift our focus. We shift from a kind of concern for an individual, or an attempt to think things through from the viewpoint of an individual. The idea there's no one who understands me, or there's no one who connects with me, or I'm on my own, to a kind of narrative which is on a different scale. These people need help. They're in trouble. They need support. And that transfer, I think that orients us towards the present. So people who are lonely now, people who have become lonely, they're the people who need our attention and our help if we are thinking of loneliness as a social problem. Also concentrates our focus on loneliness as a kind of deficit. And sometimes I think that can be distracting. And as a researcher who's interested in relationships, of course I would say that. I think that it's quite important to think about how relationships function and what they contribute to the human experience. To a degree, I think that neat transfer sidesteps questions about the conditions under which people become lonely, and what it's like to be lonely, what that actually involves, and where and how we might want to interfere in that if we're interested in doing so. And of course, where all this arises is the 2018 loneliness strategy that was announced under the Theresa May government. Following on from that, various kinds of funding and social policy were kind of unrolled. So this idea that loneliness can be understood as a kind of social problem is embedded in that context especially. So how did that happen? How did loneliness become seen to be a disruptive social force rather than a private personal experience? Well, there's a kind of rumbling concern about that in the literature. You could think about the reviews about belonging and connectedness, the importance of those experiences for human health and well-being and for psychological stability. You could think about the early work about social relationships and health, which was highlighting some of the potential costs to health and well-being that are associated with either poor social relationships or very limited social relationships. But I think the key thing is really this link in the bottom right-hand corner here, this link to increased morbidity and mortality. So this very big meta-analysis showed quite persuasively, I think, that we should be concerned about the effects of social isolation and loneliness and poor quality social relationships because people become unwell sooner and they live less long if they don't have the benefit of good social relationships. So it's sort of configured as a problem that is a problem for society at that scale in this literature. And I think that's where that pivot really happens. Now that's a non-trivial association. I think that's important. And we can see even in the fact that it's the Theresa May government that picks it up, that even a neoliberal kind of government can think, actually that's interesting, we should probably care about that. People dying too soon, that's probably a problem. So I think that, that's worth noticing. It's not simply that loneliness is bad for productivity, it's that it's a bad thing in itself if people die too soon or become unwell. What's interesting to me about the policy documents that were generated at that time is that they reflect a kind of consistency with the original sort of out there, culturally familiar idea of loneliness as a subjective experience. I might have expected it to sort of get a bit lost. So this is kind of interesting. Here's one of the definitions: a subjective, unwelcome feeling of lack or loss of companionship that happens when we have a mismatch between the quantity and quality of social relationships that we have and those that we want. I think that's quite good. I think it's quite good that subjectivity and feeling find their way into a policy document. That's kind of amazing as a psychologist. And I think it's also quite important that quality survived the policy cut there. That's not just about how many social contacts you have, because it's easy to intervene in that. We can flood people's lives with stuff they don't want. But actually meaningful relationships and good social support are the things that we know make the most difference. And it's survived, it's in there, it's in the definition. And you can see that they go on to make a distinction between that sort of objective sense of isolation and there's a commitment here to foregrounding the idea that our subjective appraisal of this as a problem really matters. So I think that's interesting, and I think to me that's recognisable. And I thought a little bit about my cultural reference points for loneliness. And one of those is definitely Ned the Lonely Donkey, which was my favourite book as a child. And Ned the Lonely Donkey opens with Ned feeling lonely. He's all alone. He's playing in the stream. He's getting quite bored of just jumping back and forward across the stream. And it interiorises Ned's loneliness as something that is a property of Ned's relationship to the world, but that is felt by Ned. I thought also about some of the kind of aesthetic representations of that, and particularly the work of Codeine, and the way that the lack of musical resolution in those pieces makes you think that there's a kind of pervasive atmosphere that you're encountering, a kind of mood that colours one's relationship with the world. And in the paper that Valeria and I have written about one bit of her PhD, one of the things that Valeria wrote was loneliness is deeply disruptive of people's experience of the world. And I think that is speaking to something fundamental in the stuff I think I had in my head that comes from these sorts of cultural reference points, and it's reflected in those general definitions that found their way into the policy, that there's something about the subjectivity of this experience that is important. So a part of me wants to sort of say, as a psychologist and a phenomenological researcher, kind of cheer a bit. That's really good that that's found its way in. But another part of me wonders if that's the subjectivity, or these are the subjectivities that we are interested in and construing as a problem, then what are the conditions under which those things arise? How can we think more carefully about the world in which Ned's loneliness is possible, right? I have a break from Ned now. So this is the model that is in a lot of those documents. It comes from a psychological paper by Peplau and Perlman. It looks kind of sensible. It's got a few different layers to it. It's including some contributory factors. It's including the context of one's life history, and it's including thoughts and feelings. Excuse me. So I think that's okay as far as it goes, but I also think there's some questions we could be asking about what's missing from that, and I think those are interesting, and perhaps a psychologist is not entirely the best person to think through the consequences of these, but I'll make a start. So I think that one of the things that's missing is a question about where do people's capacity to connect and build relationships with other people come from. We know that those kinds of capacities get disrupted and interrupted by poor attachment histories or poor early attachment relationships, by problems with emotional regulation, by exposure to trauma and adversity. There are things that happen to people in their early lives which make a difference to their ability to make relationships and connect later on. And of course, after those things have happened to people, there are things that psychologists and other professionals can do to help them to build on those capacities, but there are also things that we can do at a social policy level to ensure that those things happen less often to fewer people. So, they're not randomly distributed and inevitable forces. We can have a world in which those things happen less often to fewer people. And on top of that, I think the opportunity to connect and make connections and not be lonely is not well described in that model. It's a very psychological model because, of course, what's transferred into the political discourse is the psychological definition. But if we think about things like social capital, how people may have different kinds of social resources available to them, and how there is a context of social inequality to the distribution of those resources, then we can start to think a bit about why do some people have more and better opportunities to make connections and relationships than other people. So I think there are some interesting things missing from the model, and I just wanted to take that idea a little bit further. So to put that into context, there was a systematic review by the UCL Group who doing all kinds of interesting work on loneliness. This one came out in 2018. And it describes some of the different ways that we might like to intervene in loneliness, specifically focused on people with mental health problems who are experiencing loneliness. And if you zoom into their lovely model there, you can see they've done a couple of interesting things. So they've thought carefully about people who are lonely and what kinds of things you might do with individuals who are lonely now. What kinds of things might you do to build their confidence in developing social relationships, or to get them involved in activities which might increase their exposure to social relationships. And they've also done the same thing in terms of thinking about small social groups, so family and friends, professionals, voluntary organisations. What kind of awareness raising or kind of community type activities might happen. These are also quite psychological. And then there's a kind of public health strategy, which again is very much about awareness raising. So those are interesting, but to me what's really interesting is the bit that they've added, which is not really there in the literature that they've been able to review because they're limited to where there are intervention studies. And it's that indirect text, it's the white text there. So they're also thinking, and I think these are speaking to the kind of structural issues that I'm curious about. They're also speaking about what kinds of things could we be doing with our social policy, with our urban development, with our, with plans for how we make the world less likely to expose people to events which reduce their capacity to build relationships, and how do we make a world in which it's more easy for people to build and develop connections with people. And those suggestions in there seem to me like the most interesting bit in this paper. You can see, this is just an aside really, but you can see that the kinds of things where there are evidence are much more focused on what can you do to change people's thinking or behaviour. And of course that's fine, there is a place for that. Some people who are lonely will be lonely because they're socially anxious, and there are sensible psychological interventions that we can offer to those people that will help them to feel less anxious about their social connections, for example. So for people who are lonely now, the strategies that are available look quite promising. But in terms of building a world in which there are fewer lonely people in future, it's the stuff that isn't really being evidenced. It's the kind of wider social policy things which I think are most promising and most interesting, and I feel like they're a bit left out of the conversation about loneliness. Oops. So social capital often links directly to economic capital. It means there's a health inequalities component to the relationship between social connections and well-being and health. So some people definitely have more of it, and those people tend also to have more economic capital. And interestingly, it's also evident that there's a psychological aspect to this. So those people who've got the capacity to build reciprocal relationships tend also to make better use of the social capital that is available to them. They're more effective at using the opportunities that their local community and environs provide. And so these two things interact with one another, and it means that potentially there are disadvantaged groups who miss out on these capacities and opportunities. So this is where I get well out of my wheelhouse, because these are really social policy type ideas. And colleagues in social policy will have a much better sense of what kinds of things can be done. But I think it's possible for us to think about ways in which we can reduce young people's exposure to trauma and adversity. And it's possible for us to think about ways in which we can build the capacity and opportunity for connection and belonging in the communities in which people live. And that we can do that by attending to health inequalities and thinking about things like social capital and economic insecurity. So, the obvious example here is Sure Start. Sure Start was a long-term investment that attempted to meet the basic needs of new parents, to provide scaffolding around supportive parenting, to reduce new babies' exposure to adversity and trauma, and to create conditions in which those young people might thrive. And famously, the tail on seeing the health and economic benefit of that was very, very long. It was so many years long that by the time that the report was published, the incoming government was closing Sure Start centres. So that there's a kind of a challenge here in that what we are thinking about, if we're thinking about loneliness as a serious social problem, is addressing something that's got a really long tail on it. And I just thought I'll finish with NED. The interesting thing about NED is that NED does have a community navigator. So in some of the work that the UCL Group have been doing, one of the things that they have been doing is thinking about what's the role of other people in helping us to make connections with people that we might become friends with, or with social groups who might help support us or might give us better social capital or a better experience. Ned's story is driven by a magpie So there's a magpie that comes along, and he doesn't offer to be Ned's friend, he offers to introduce Ned to someone who might be his friend. And when that relationship is interrupted because the person that he becomes friend with goes to school, the magpie reappears and takes Ned to meet some other donkeys, and there's a community of donkeys that he belongs to. And so that idea is already out there, that there are things we can do to connect people to others. But of course, the crucial thing for Ned is the availability of that community of donkeys. They're not that far away, he just doesn't know they're there. And so from a sort of social structure, opportunity and capacity point of view, he has the capacity to make those relationships, but he doesn't have the opportunity until the navigator says, that's actually there, that's there for you, you can meet these other donkeys. So anyway, that's where I'll finish. Thank you.